me the story of Jesus. Write on my heart every word. Tell me the story most precious, sweetest that ever was heard. Loving that story so tender, clearer than ever I see. Say, let me read what you whisper, love in the ransom for me. Tell me the story most precious, sweetest that ever was heard.
Okay, we're going to continue our study on the existence of God. We started this last week. I'm not sure how long it'll take to get through it. I'm not going to worry about it in a few weeks. But and last week we defined some terms. We defined the term theism as the belief or acknowledgement of the existence of a God as opposed to atheism. But theism differs from deism, for although deism implies a belief in the existence of a God, yet it signifies in modern usage a denial of revelation, which theism does not. Theism and revelation go together. The idea of theism is that God revealed himself to us somehow. Where deism, God created everything and went to sleep, and we don't know what he wants. Atheism is the disbelief of the existence of a God or supreme intelligent being, and also disregard of duty to God is known as practical atheism. So, even though someone may claim that they believe in God, if they live as if they don't believe it, then for all intents and purposes, they're an atheist. It's known as practical atheism. We defined what who God is, or what he is, last week. We noticed that the biblical name of God is Jehovah, which means the self-existent or eternal one. We noticed that God exists totally of himself, that he owes his existence to no other. And we referred to the word over in Exodus 3:14, where he says, "I am that I am." That the Hebrew comes from the Hebrew that word's defined from means to be or to exist. He is the one that exists and has always existed. We've made the point that God is infinite in duration, in power, in presence, in goodness, and in knowledge, and he's the perfection of being, and there's absolutely no deficiency in him. If there were, then he wouldn't be God. We also pointed out that there can only be one infinite being. There can only be one. If there's more than one, then they cancel each other out. There can only be one. We looked at the argument for the existence of God is logically compelling. We looked at several arguments last week. The argument from efficient causes, the idea of cause and effect. You have to go back to a first cause. We looked at the argument from the degrees of perfection of characteristics. We looked at the argument from evident design in the universe. We looked at the fact that Paul argues that the existence of God is clearly proved from the visible creation. That this is not an opinion, that it's proven by the creation itself. And we went through that. And that to deny the invisible God is to deny the obvious. We also looked at from the visible universe that we can conclude how powerful this being must be to be able to create something like this in 6 days. And let's remember that he didn't create it in 6 days because it took him, because he needed 6 days. He created the world in 6 days to teach us a lesson, to teach us that we cannot work 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. We can't do it. We will break down. We need a day a week to take in rest. He didn't need to rest, but we do, and he knew that. And so he gave us a pattern that you work for 6 days and rest on the seventh. That was the whole purpose behind that. We also looked at the fact that there are 4 possibilities to explain the existence of the universe. The first being that the universe spontaneously emerged from nothing, and we showed how ridiculous that is. That the universe is eternal, and we showed that contraries the first and second laws of thermodynamics, which are the most proven laws of all science. We looked at the idea that the universe does not exist. That's actually an argument, and that's, you would have to deny your own existence in order to come up with that one, because you're here, right? And the only one left is the idea that a power greater than the universe brought it into being, and that power that brought it into being is obviously God. We looked at the fact that the existence of God may be deduced from the fact that all men acknowledge a standard of right and wrong that is above them, by which they judge their actions. Even people that do not believe in God believe in a standard of right and wrong. Now, they believe that they get to make up the standard of right and wrong, but if that's the case, then why is their opinion any more valid than someone else's? How would it be? If I get to make up the rules, and I can make up whatever rules I want, and I then become God, right? If I set the standards, am I not God? And if there is no ultimate truth, if there is no ultimate standard, then why is my standard not just as good as yours? Why is yours not just as good as someone else's? Okay, we have no ultimate standard if we do not have a God. All we have then are rules of men, and we have already seen that rules of men change. We saw that this week, depending on public opinion. So those aren't even ultimate standards. The idea of what was the ultimate standard 50 years ago is no longer that ultimate standard today, because people's opinions have changed. The only way there can be an ultimate standard is if there is a God that said it, and if he revealed it to us somehow. So any standard devised only by the authority of man is not absolute, because it can change, and does. Now, that brings us up to date for this morning. We can continue on from here. And the first thing that I want to point out, and that is the universal experience of mankind confirms the existence of God. Okay? The universal experience of mankind confirms the existence of God. All nations have acknowledged the existence of a God. All of them. Even those nations that later denied it as a matter of official policy, like Russia and China, they've acknowledged the existence of God. Consider that all of those nations that have officially denied it have not succeeded in convincing all of the people that live there that there's no God. Do you think that no one in Russia, at the time it was the Soviet Union, that every person in Russia was an atheist? Maybe from the standpoint of if the government asked you, but they had the Russian Orthodox Church. They weren't all atheists. Many of them believed in God. They just weren't able to come out publicly with it for fear that they'd be shot. But even if a nation takes a position that there isn't one, they have never been able to convince all of the population that there's no God. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. Joseph Stalin actually enlisted the support of the Russian Orthodox Church during World War II. Now, Joseph Stalin was an atheist, but he went to the Russian Orthodox Church and enlisted their efforts because he knew that they could rouse the people better than he could. Because of this thing that's inside of man that strives to know God. This is something that God put inside of man, and you can't deny that. We have people in this room that at one time were atheists. Conrad J.L. at one time was an atheist. We have people in this room that were practical atheists because they may have believed that maybe there was something out there, but they didn't know anything about it and were never taught anything about it. Right? I think we would all be in agreement of that. And yet every one of you you're here now. Somewhere within the heart of man there is a void that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. And that void, people have used anything they can try to find to fill that void up. And that void is a desire to know what's beyond, to know if there's a God, and to understand that there must be. That's in the heart of man. God put it there. Even fallen man has that void. So it doesn't matter if the United States of America takes the position that there is no God. If they go the way of Russia, is that going to convince the entire population that there isn't one? No. You see, so the experience of mankind proves there must be. There must be one. There's something about the existence of God that cannot be erased from the consciousness of man. And it doesn't matter how hard you try, you can't do it. Because there is a yearning in man that can only be fulfilled in a relationship with God. It's the only way to fulfill that yearning. Now, because of sin, this yearning in man has been misdirected towards all kinds of stuff. But they never fully satisfy the yearning. I don't care how much you drink, it will not satisfy the yearning. I don't care how many sexual relationships you get involved in, it will not satisfy the yearning. I don't care how much gambling you do, it will not satisfy the yearning. I don't care how much money you make, it will not satisfy the yearning. There is a yearning within the heart of man, and this includes fallen man, that cannot be satisfied by this world. The only way it can be fully satisfied is by a relationship with God. That's the only way. And that's what I mean when I say that the experience of mankind proves that there's the existence of God. Because where did that come from? If God didn't put it there, where did it come from? I'm always amazed that this idea of in fact, I read one of these points today on some post that somebody made. The idea that religion is something that was made up by the cavemen or something. Now, let's think about that one for a minute. Okay, we have, first off, we didn't evolve over millions of years, and yes, there were people that lived in caves. There are still people that live in caves. Last time before Osama bin Laden was killed, I think he lived in a cave. Does that make him well, yeah, I guess he kind of was a caveman. But the point is, there have always been people that took shelter wherever. So what? That doesn't mean that we evolved from them. They were just, had no place else to live. Okay? But if we take this idea from the evolutionist position that we evolved, and somehow these cavemen, they couldn't communicate with each other, they didn't know how to talk, they didn't have any words, they just kind of grunted or whatever, and maybe figured out how to make fire, you know, like in 2001, the Space Odyssey movie. And yet they're the ones that are credited with developing theology. That they're the ones that came up with the idea that there was a God. So we have people that can't talk, but they come up with this. They develop theology, and now it's in the heart of man because of cavemen that couldn't even communicate with each other. I mean, if you think things through, it's absolutely absurd, the idea that people have. But everyone has this within them. And again, I'm not just talking about Christians. I'm talking about everybody. Every man has within him this desire, this void, and it cannot be filled without the relationship with God. Therefore, there are a lot of people out there that it can never be filled for. And as a result of this, since religion is so persuasive, atheistic movements will always fail. They can try all they want to, but they will fail. Now, understand that it is true that while men seek God, most of them don't worship Him properly. And most of the nations that have worshiped God have done so through idolatry and have not worshiped Him correctly because for one reason or another, they either didn't know how or they didn't care how. Many of them in the Old Testament age didn't know how because God had only revealed Himself to the Jews. In the New Testament age, He's revealed Himself. Now we have a different situation. We have people that should know how, but don't most of the time because they don't care. They're perfectly happy with a God that they don't have to worry about. So they're still involved in idolatry. They don't know that they are, or they don't think that they are, but they don't want to give up their funds, so we'll just continue to do what we're doing. Turn to Romans chapter 1 and verse 21. Romans chapter 1 and verse 21 says, "Because that when they knew God, they glorified Him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things." Here you have idolatry. Here you have the nations slipping into idolatry because what they could have known of God, they refused to know of God. And I want you to understand something. A lot of the things that we read in the book of Romans are judgments that God makes upon people because they refuse to know Him. You look around this country and you hear people all the time saying, God's going to judge us for this. No, you're missing the point. God has judged us for this, and this is the result. The Supreme Court decision that was made this week is not something that God will judge us on. It is the judgment of God upon this godless nation for turning our back on God so many years ago. And this is what God does to nations that do that. So we're right in line. Read Romans when you get home. Read these passages. We're going to look at some of them today. This is exactly what God does to a nation that turns their back on Him. This is where it ends up. Now, where it goes from here, I don't know. It'll get worse, I'm assuming, but what's the next hill that somebody's going to die on? I'm not sure. If I knew that, I'd be laying money on it somewhere doing something other than what I'm doing here. I can't predict the future. I can just give you kind of an idea of what's happening based on the past. Now I want you to think of something else also. Turn to Revelation chapter 13, because the last world empire that comes into existence is not going to be atheistic. It will be a theistic empire. Revelation chapter 13, verse 4 says, "And they worshipped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him?" Atheists don't worship idols. They don't worship people. They don't worship things. They only worship themselves. But this is going to be something that people are going to worship. Hence, it is going to be religion. In the last days, Satan's religion will be a theistic empire. Whatever that thing is when it gets here, if it's not already here, will have religion tied to it. Look at 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 through 4 says, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. You see, the end of this is not going to be atheistic. It will be theistic. It will be religious. A theistic movement will conquer this world, but it will be the wrong theism. Machiavelli, I don't know if you know who he is or not. Some of you probably have heard the name. He taught that religion was the most important characteristic for a prince to seem to have. He said, for the mob is always impressed by appearances and by results, and the world is composed of the mob. This is why leaders try to pretend to be godly. Even the one we got in the White House now is always quoting scripture. He's misquoting it. I remember Bill Clinton used to see pictures of him carrying a Bible around in his hand. They always try to look like they're good people because the mob wants to follow good people. They apparently read Machiavelli. And not only that, in Isaiah chapter 14, we find out something about Satan. Isaiah chapter 14. And verse 14, he says, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. So Satan wants to be like God. So you can assume that whatever power he brings into this place, it's going to look religious. Does that not help you to understand the false churches that are out there and why they're there? The churches that teach something contrary to the Bible? And who's really in control of those things? Those are his temples. And eventually some form of theism will take over this world. Hadn't happened yet that I know of, but unless you look at all of them and combine them all together, but I don't want to get into that kind of speculation. This argues the existence of a Most High. I mean, if Satan strives to be like the Most High, there has to be a Most High for him to strive to be like. And that argues for the existence of a God. And as God has a kingdom over which he reigns, so Satan will have an imitation kingdom over which he will reign. The only difference is that God's is everlasting and Satan's is temporal. And so you want to make sure you're in the right one. And remember also that false theism is the perversion of theism. It's not something different. So Satan's church is theism, but it's false theism. It's not atheism. It is theism. Another thing that we have to consider, and that is that men are troubled by the thought of a God against whom they've sinned. Even those that deny the existence of God are from time to time troubled by the thought that they might be wrong, especially when they're facing death. And we've had experiences that show that even those that deny God, when they get close to death, they are troubled by the idea that they could be wrong. I think most of us have, from one time or another, woken up in a cold sweat wondering, what happens if I die tonight? Am I okay? Well, you know what? Even atheists have those problems. Richard Dawkins, they asked him one time, are you absolutely sure what's going to happen to you when you die? No. Ever bother you? Yeah. Don't know. Because there's no way to know. You know, death brings us to the end of our time on this earth. And it brings us to the brink of eternity, which brings us before the eternal one, which is God. Have you ever considered that we have chaplains in the military? We have chaplains in hospitals. Wendy works for a hospice. They have a whole wing of chaplains in the hospice, right? Have you ever seen a chaplain in a nightclub? Have you ever seen a chaplain at a sporting event, or at a theater, or at an amusement park, or at a concert? You ever seen a chaplain there? See, people aren't concerned with death in those places. But in places where they're concerned with death, the military, hospitals, hospice, airports, for people that are afraid to fly. You know, there's a chapel in most airports. If you know where to look, there's one at Tampa. Real easy to see. In case something happens. So when people are faced with death, then all of a sudden they wake up to something and they realize, what if there is something out there that I've been denying all this time? And they have to, and that's why we have chaplains in those situations. But not when you're able to blow it off. Now let me ask you a question. I mentioned the fact that there are a lot of people that think that religion is something that was invented by man. Let's say it was invented by modern man. Let's get the guy out of the cave and actually give him a little bit of intelligence. Let's say he actually understood math and came. That's the guy that came up with the idea of a God. Why would we keep him around? Something that causes people so much grief, so much anguish, so much fear. Why would we keep that in our society if he weren't true? Just ponder that for a little bit. Why would that be something that every human being on the planet has this void that they try to fill? And if it was just made up, why wouldn't we get rid of it? Why would we keep it around? Because we don't have a choice. It's in our heart, and there's nothing we can do about it. Now, the next point that I want to make here is that atheism, which denies the existence of God, cannot be proven. Now, an atheist might want to think that he can prove there's a God. I actually tend to think that when you get into a discussion with an atheist, what they're really trying to do, they want you to prove there's a God so that when you can't prove there's a God, they can justify themselves in their sin and say, see, there's somebody else that can't prove it. He must not exist. I'm okay. But throw the argument back on them. Prove there isn't one. You had to admit the idea that the concept could be sound by even asking the question. So prove that there isn't a God. They cannot do it. An atheist cannot prove that there is no God. And let me explain why. A couple of points first. Number one, theism and atheism are mutually exclusive positions. They are diametrically opposed to each other. They cannot both be right, and they cannot both be wrong. One of them is true and one of them is false. Okay, understand that. You can't have both. Okay, it can't be, well, atheism's true and theism. No, it's one or the other. You get to pick one. In order to prove that there's no God, you'd have to meet the following qualifications. First, you'd have to be omnipresent. You'd have to be everywhere in order to prove that there's no God. Now, maybe you don't see him right now in this room, but what's to say he's not out there in the lobby? You'd have to go out there in the lobby to see if he's in the lobby or not. And when you went out that door to check, he might have come in that door over there. Right? What if he's not here, but he's across the street at the hamburger place? What if look at the universe. He could be anywhere. You would have to be everywhere in order to prove that he's not somewhere. You have to be everywhere, right? He might be hiding in the closet. So you would have to be omnipresent in order to prove that there is no God. And that doesn't mean that you get to be here now and in the lobby 3 minutes from now. That means you have to be everywhere at the same time in order to prove there's no God. And you can't do that. None of us are omnipresent. You would have to be eternal in order to prove that there's no God. Because what if he just decided not to show himself this week, but he was here before eternity and he hasn't shown himself again for quite a while? You see, you would have to be eternal and omnipresent in order to prove there's no God. Because you'd have to be everywhere all the time. If there's anywhere that you are not, for a split second, that could be where the time that God decided to show himself. So to prove he's not there, you have to be eternal, and you have to be omnipresent everywhere all the time from eternity in order to absolutely prove there's no God. There's something else. You'd have to be omniscient. You'd have to possess all knowledge of all things all the time. Because if there's one thing that you don't know, that one thing might be God. There might, if you know 5% of the knowledge in the universe, and I don't think any of us know that, but if you knew 5% of all the knowledge in the universe, there could be something in the 95% that you don't know that contradicts the 5% that you think you do know. So you would have to have all knowledge in order to prove there's no God. That makes you omniscient. You would also have to be omnipotent. To be eternally everywhere with all knowledge of all things all the time would require the power to sustain such a state of existence. For if that power failed so much as 1 second to be in a single place, that just might be the time or place where God showed himself. Do you see how it's impossible to prove that there's no God? If your power failed to enable you to know one single thing, that one single thing might be God. Therefore, you have to be omnipresent, eternal, omniscient, and omnipotent to prove that there is no God. And guess what? If you are omnipresent, eternal, omniscient, and omnipotent, you are God. And you cannot prove that there is no God, because in order to prove there's no God, you have to be God, and God therefore exists. So the next time one of these guys comes up and asks you to prove that there is no God, ask him to prove, or ask you to prove there is a God, ask him to prove there isn't one. And see how he deals with that. You cannot do it. Because to prove there's no God, you have to be God. And if you're God, then there's a God. It's impossible to prove there's no God. Something else, atheism is a universal negative that cannot be proven. A universal negative would require one to possess universal presence and duration and knowledge and power. And nobody but God possesses that. So the existence of God cannot logically be denied. In Psalm chapter 14, Psalm chapter 14 and verse 1 says, "The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God." It emphatically states, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, they've done abominable works, there is none that doeth good. The same statement is made again over in Psalm 53, verse 1. A fool is defined as one that is deficient in judgment or sense, one who acts or behaves stupidly, a silly person, a simpleton. In biblical use, it's applied to a vicious or impious person. Okay? God says it's a fool that says in his heart that there's no God. This is a corruption of the mind. It's a corruption of his thinking. And it's foolish to say that there's no God. And someone that truly believes there's no God is a fool. It doesn't matter how otherwise intelligent a man may be. He may be really smart when it comes to things in the world, but that doesn't make any difference. If he doesn't believe there's a God, he's a fool. It doesn't matter how socially advanced he is. None of that makes any difference at all, because the logical arguments for the existence of God are so compelling that only someone lacking normal sense would believe that they don't apply, or would then deny the existence of God. An atheist fool might display wisdom in the management of some of his affairs in this world, which they do. Luke chapter 16 and verse 8 says this. And the Lord commended the unjust steward because he had done wisely, for the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. They might be wise when it comes to worldly affairs. They might be better businessmen. They might be better with finances. They may be wise in those sense, but they're still a fool. Because whatever wisdom he demonstrates is borrowed from the very God that he denies. Any wisdom you have as a gift of God. It's foolish to deny the very God that gave you the wisdom that you have in order to be successful in this world. And he's a fool for not tracing that wisdom up to its rightful source. Another point is that eventually he will be found out. Turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 10. Ecclesiastes chapter 10 and verse 3 says, Yea, also when he that is a fool walketh by the way, his wisdom faileth him, and he saith to everyone that he is a fool. Eventually he will be found out to be a fool. Now, if we go back to Romans chapter 3, I want you to see that the Apostle Paul takes those passages that we looked at in Psalms 14, and when we looked at Psalms 14, I mentioned Psalm 53, and he takes those verses and advances his proof of the depravity of all mankind here in Romans chapter 3, verses 9 through 12, where he says, What then, are we better than they? No, in no wise, for we have before proved, both Jews and Gentiles, that they are all under sin. As it is written, There is none righteous, no, not one. There is none that understandeth. There is none that seeketh after God. They are all gone out of the way. They are together become unprofitable. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. Now, according to Psalms 14 and 53, this description of the corruption of mankind can be traced back to atheism. This is the continuation of those passages over in Psalms. And remember what it said in Psalms? The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. And then we continue on with this. This can all be traced back to this idea of atheism, which is the denial of God's existence. In Romans chapter 3, verses 9 through 18, well, we already read part of it. How far did we get? We got down to 12. Look at verse 13. Their throat is an open sepulchre. With their tongues they have used deceit. The poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their ways, and the way of peace have they not known. There's no fear of God before their eyes. All of this traces back to this idea of atheism. So Paul traces all ignorance, deceit, cursing, bitterness, murder, destruction, misery, contention, war, and irreligion back to atheistic principles. So I want you to think of any sin and destruction and misery that it causes. Sins such as fornication, adultery, theft, envy, covetousness, drunkenness, homosexuality, all of them trace all the way back to this idea of atheism. The sins of the human, and this is something else to pay close attention to, the sins of the human race leave a swath of destruction and misery because people start to get involved in these sins, and what does that leave behind it? It leaves crushing debt. It leaves ruined neighborhoods. It leaves poverty, disease, broken hearts, broken homes, broken lives. And it all traces back to this idea of at least practical atheism, if not full-on atheism. It leads back to the idea of not being responsible with your duty toward God and allowing your own flesh nature to run amok. And that can apply to people that are sitting in a church. You take your eyes off of God and start looking at the world and try to fill the void that's missing because you don't have a good relationship with God, and you will fall right into these sins and start living as if you don't believe there's a God, and you're practically an atheist at that point. And this is what it leaves behind. Destruction and misery are in the way, and the way of peace have they not known. Think also of the cruelty of different atheistic regimes. Look at look at the murder and the genocide that has come from these people. First and foremost, there's a corruption of man's thinking. And then out of that thinking, there's a corruption of his behavior. It first starts in the mind, and then it continues into the being. That's why we're told to flee youthful lusts. You know, when it says flee youthful lusts, that doesn't mean the lust of a kid. It means when it starts to rear its ugly head, get away from it as quickly as it can before it grows up. Because once it grows up, you may not be able to. The minute that you start to see that you're slipping into an area that you shouldn't be in, run away from it. Turn around and run. Flee it. Don't let it take hold. Grab it while it's young. In Titus chapter 1 and verse 16, we read, "They profess that they know God, but in works they deny Him, being abominable and disobedient, and unto every good work reprobate." Even if people profess to know there's a God, if they do abominable works, they're thereby denying God. They're acting as if there was no God, and that's practical atheism. And that can even take root in the church. That can even grab some of the people within a church that aren't grounded and haven't paid enough attention and haven't studied and haven't done their homework, and all of a sudden they hear something and start to drift off into an area where they shouldn't be. So it follows, as hard as this is to say, it follows that the entire human race has been poisoned with atheism. In some areas, every one of us have to fight this. Because in some areas we can drift into it if we're not careful. Now, let's get to the reason that men deny the existence of God. Because there is a reason, and that is that the idea of a God who made them and holds them accountable and responsible for their actions interferes with what they want to do. It interferes with their fun, and according to Paul, it interferes with their sex life. And they don't like that. So let's get rid of this guy because he's causing me anguish. Paul traces sexual perversion right to the source of atheistic thinking. Okay? Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1, verses 26 through 28. For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections. For even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Aldous Huxley. I think he was a Brit. He wrote a bunch of books, but one of the books that he wrote was called Ends and Means, and he proves this point that this is that the reason that people want to deny a God is because they don't like the idea of God being involved in their affairs. So let's just deny he exists, and then I can do whatever I want to do, and I can live however I want to live, because he's not out there anyway. Right? He said, I had motives for not wanting the world to have a meaning, and consequently assumed that if it had none, and was able without any consequently assumed that it had none, and was able without any difficulty to find satisfying reasons for this assumption. The philosopher who finds no meaning in the world is not concerned exclusively with a problem in pure metaphysics. He is also concerned to prove that there is no valid reason why he personally should not do as he wants to do. For myself, as no doubt for most of my friends, the philosophy of meaninglessness was essentially an instrument of liberation from a certain system of morality. We objected to the morality because it interfered with our sexual freedom. Do you not see something here in the United States that you might be able to say is practical atheism, folks? And in reading these passages in Romans, does that not show what happens and what homosexuality really is? That is just sexual perversion run amok. Because if a guy pardon my language in this, if a guy gets so kinky that he can't be satisfied with a woman, what's next? Another guy? What comes after that? A chicken? That's all it is. That's all in the world it is. And another point here is that if a perverse man does not exclude the idea of God altogether from his thinking, then he rejects the true God, and he invents a God according to his own imagination that will let him do what he wants to do. Look at Romans chapter 1 and verse 21. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, into birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. Now watch this. Who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshiped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. So even if you get to the point that you're going to admit there's a God, you may still run towards a false God so that you can do what you want to do. You see, being a Christian means getting rid of all that stuff. When you, and I went over this in a sermon I did, I think when I was in Las Vegas. When you are regenerated, God puts within you the ability to deal with any problem that you have and to deal with any sin that you have. You have the ability to do it if you're regenerate. If you can't do it, then maybe you're not regenerate. But if you are regenerate, you have within you the ability to deal with any sin that comes down the pike. Now, maybe you don't do it, maybe you don't deal with it, well, then you'll answer to God for it in this life if you're regenerate. But you have the ability to deal with it. So deal with it. That's what God says. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God that worketh in you both to will and to do of His good pleasure. He puts it within you so that you can deal with it. So if you have a problem, if you have a sin that you're struggling with, deal with it. Deal with it biblically and get it behind you and repent of it and move on. Because you have the ability. There's no sense in wallowing in it any longer. And don't then invent some other God because you just don't want to deal with your own problems. And that's what so many have done. That's why there's 1,250 or 1,300 or 1,500 different denominations. I lost count at 1,250. That was in, the book I had was in 1970 something, and there were 1,250 then. There's probably 50,000 of them by now. All of them calling themselves Christian, and all of them designed for the idea that you go ahead and do what you want to do. It's okay. Okay, let's get to another point here. Consider this, that the Bible that the atheist rejects, the very Bible that he rejects, shows what's in his heart and shows how he will behave because of what is in his heart. Think of that. We just read the verses. We know exactly where you're going to go. If you take this position, God tells us in advance where you're going to end up in this world. He tells us where you're going to end up in the end too, but in this life, you start to deny God, and this is where you're going to go. And the very Bible that the atheist denies is the book that shows what's in his heart and proves it. The atheist proves the Bible by the way he rejects the Bible. And that's another proof for the existence of God who wrote the Bible. Now let's go through one more point here, and then we'll wrap this up for this morning. I mentioned this a little bit, I believe, last week. Now I'll do it. I was chasing a rabbit last week. I'll do it formally this week. And that's the idea that it's safer. It's safer to believe God exists than to believe He doesn't. It's actually safer. Blaise Pascal characterized some of his friends that were ignoring the most important issues of life. I'm going to read a little bit from his writing. It says, I know not who put me into the world, nor what the world is, nor what I myself am. I'm in terrible ignorance of everything. All I know is that I must soon die, but what I know least is this very death which I cannot escape. As I know not whence I come, so I know not whither I go. I know only that in leaving this world, I fall forever either into annihilation or into the hands of an angry God, without knowing to which of these two states I shall forever be assigned. Such is my state, full of weakness and uncertainty. And from all this I conclude that I ought to spend all the days of my life without caring to inquire into what must happen to me. Perhaps I might find some solution to my doubts, but I will not take the trouble nor take a step to seek it. Think about this. If you seriously contemplate death, all of us are going to die someday. Nobody gets out of here alive. We've seen it. Do you know anybody that was here 200 years ago that's still walking around? No, they're all dead. What he's saying here is that when I die, I'm either just going to turn into dust and rot, or I'm going to be standing before an angry God who's mad at me. If we contemplate this, and remember, let's take this out of the equation, right? We're going to take because we have revelation. Let's take that out of the equation for a minute. And let's think of somebody that doesn't have this, that doesn't have this book, and is serious to contemplate, where do I go when I die? Which men do, whether they have this book or not. They wonder about these things. Wouldn't it make sense for a reasonable person to put all of their effort into trying to find out where they're going to go? And yet they don't. They take no care about it at all. They might think about it for a minute and then back to the party. Does that not prove the depravity of mankind? Do you not think it would make sense to try to figure out where I'm going so I can fix this problem I'm in, if there's a way to fix it? And man doesn't do it. And that's exactly what he's saying. Perhaps I might find some solution to my doubts, but I'll not take the trouble nor take a step to seek it. If it were possible to know what comes after death, only a fool would not take the pains to find out. Don't you think? Especially if finding out might be to his advantage. Stephen Charnock said, "By confessing a God, I venture no loss, but by denying him, I run the most desperate hazard, if there be one." You see, let me read this first and then I'll comment on it. This came from Conrad J.L. This is something that he wrote relative to Pascal's wager. We read a little bit about Pascal. Now we'll read about this wager that he had. It was his. This is how he thought his way through this. Okay, if God does not exist, then an atheist and a theist have the same fate. Nothing. Right? Okay. Thus, there's no eternal advantage to being correct in atheism. In addition, there's no temporal advantage either, since atheists don't seem to be any happier than theists. In fact, they seem to be less happy in most cases. So there's no eternal advantage to being an atheist. There's no temporal advantage to being an atheist. And also, the atheist can never know he was right. Think about that. If you're an atheist and you're right, you'll never know it. You'll die and turn into dirt, and you'll never know you were right. And how much that would make Richard Dawkins unhappy not to be able to rub our nose, and he wouldn't be able to do it. If you're right, you're just going to rot. That's the end. So you can never know you're correct, and the theist can never know he was wrong. If God does not exist. If God does exist, then an atheist will likely suffer eternally for rejecting belief in God. At least his atheism isn't going to help him. And the theist, however, will likely live in eternal happiness with God, or at least his theism isn't going to hurt him. So there's an eternal advantage to being correct in theism. Also, the theist will know forever he's correct, and the atheist will always know and regret that he was wrong. Therefore, it's more reasonable to believe in God than not to believe in God. It's safer to believe in God than not to believe in God. You see, this is one of the things that I run into a lot, this idea of, okay, if you're right, then you know what, I'm good with that. Mr. Atheist, if you're right and I turn into dirt when I die, I'm okay with that. I don't want to go to hell. And that's what I'm afraid's out there. Because I'm scared to death of that angry God on the other side of the curtain. I don't think he's a little guy like the Wizard of Oz pulling, with a magnifying. I think he's serious. And I think he's real. But if I turn into dirt, okay, it doesn't harm me, but you're never going to know that you were right. I'll never know that I was wrong. And have I harmed anyone by trying to teach people to be more moral, be more ethical, to be more adult? No. I haven't harmed anybody by doing that. But if the atheist is wrong, well, let's just say I'm happy that I'm on the other side of the coin. Okay, with that, I think I can, well, no, I need to wrap this up. Let's go ahead. We'll leave the next point for next week. We'll cut off here for now, and we'll pick up the next point next week as we continue on with this. Probably a couple more Sundays, and we'll be able to wrap this up. So we're making ground. We're making headway. There's not, like I said in the beginning of this, there's not as many verses, and since there's less verses, there's less opportunity for me to chase rabbits. And so I can actually just keep walking rather than running sideways off into the bush. So we'll probably be able to get this wrapped up in a couple of weeks. So let's stand and sing number 37, and then we'll dismiss with prayer.